Good afternoon and welcome to First Tuesday. We are thrilled you've decided to join us today. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to mention. All participants have been muted and your video turned off. This event is being recorded and will be made available next week. And finally, there will be time to ask questions at the end of the event, so please put those in the Q&A function. And now I'll pass it over to the Dean of the Carlson School of Management, Dean Zaheer.
Thank you, Amy, and good afternoon. I'm Shri Zaheer, Dean of the Carlson School of Management. Welcome, everyone, to the very first Tuesday of 2022. This new year has certainly brought new challenges, but I'm glad to see that there's new hope as well as the number of cases decline, and we hear there's a likelihood of even babies getting permission to be vaccinated, and that seems to be on the horizon as well. So anything that will help us stop talking about this, all the time would be wonderful. Anyway, despite these challenges, as I said, we have much to celebrate, like the Gophers beating West Virginia and winning our 5th straight bowl game. Row the boat, go Gophers, Skayuma, isn't that just terrific? Anyway, this year is also very special as it marks the 30th year of First Tuesday, which has now become the longest running business gathering in Minnesota. And while all these landmarks are gratifying, all of our organizations and each of us individually are still learning how to navigate through this pandemic and really beginning to imagine what a COVID endemic world might look like after we get through this. Anyhow, now more than ever, I think we must celebrate what's most important, which is the connections that bring us all together, whether we're meeting in person or we're back again online. To the hundreds throughout our global community who are connecting with us online, I'm so excited that you all have the chance to hear from our speaker today. And it's been wonderful to have this audience, global audience present at First Tuesday since we went virtual, and we will continue to be hybrid as we go forward. To the hundreds again, and then before we move on to our program, I would like to recognize our long-standing corporate and media sponsors, Wells Fargo and Twin Cities Business. And of course, a very special thank you to the many Carlson School and University of Minnesota supporters who are in attendance today. The programs that set the Carlson School apart wouldn't be possible without you, our alumni, our friends, and our corporate partners who support us. And thank you also to those who've invested in our students and in our faculty in the past, and those of you who choose to invest in us in the future. We couldn't be where we are without all of your help. Today, we're joined by our featured speaker, Jasmine Jirele, for a fireside chat about the new reality of retirement. You might wonder what exactly is that, and we're going to hear about it from Jasmine. Jasmine became the president and CEO of Allianz Life Insurance this past year, having previously led Allianz's growth and marketing team. She has broad experience in financial services strategy, marketing, product, and operations. And prior to her career with Allianz, Jasmine was an executive vice president at Wells Fargo, who've been our longtime sponsor of the First Tuesday series. Jasmine is very involved in the financial industry and in the Minnesota business community, and has been an ardent supporter of diversity, equity, and inclusion, having served in several advisory roles focused particularly on education access. Jasmine received her BA from St. Thomas, where she currently serves on Opus College's Strategic Board of Advisors, and she received her MBA from Hamlin. So she's very much someone from the Twin Cities. And as we all know, the past few years have seen fundamental shifts in our society, and it has required all of our businesses to adapt to fit the new needs of what people expect, how people want to work. So while we hear many reports about how customer-facing companies are adapting, and I've even had speakers from some of these giant firms join us at First Tuesday, companies like Allianz Life have to take a long-term view on what these changes that are occurring are going to mean 20 or even 30 years down the road. And so, just as we've seen in nearly every aspect of society, the reality of retirement is also shifting in real time. So under Jasmine's leadership, Allianz Life is meeting this challenge of the new reality of retirement today. So we'd love to hear from her. Jasmine, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, Jasmine, I'll start off with some questions for you before we move to the audience. But, to start with, Jasmine, you took over your leadership of Allianz Life, which is not the North American flagship operation of Allianz SC, which is one of the world's largest financial services organizations. But you started just earlier last year. So tell me a little bit about your first few months as president and CEO.
Well, yeah, you mentioned this great period of change that we're living in, and I think that's definitely shaped how I've come into my position and a lot about how I'm thinking about the future of Allianz and the retirement industry. So I think is extremely exciting time to be leading the company. I was able to have a nice, long and carefully planned transition with my predecessor, Walter White, who's a very well-known leader in the Twin Cities community and the financial services industry. And I think that really set our organization up to continue to run smoothly and effectively, despite all the other changes and challenges that we're seeing in the external environment today. I'm extremely proud of the fact that despite some of these headwinds we faced as an organization and as a society, our employees continue to give us very high marks for our culture and employee satisfaction with our roughly 2,200 employees, primarily here in the Twin Cities. And we've continued to really excel as an employer of choice in the Twin Cities, and I'm very proud of that. I'm also proud of how we've adapted and adjusted our business model to really reflect the current environment and come up with some new creative solutions to serve our clients. So while there are a lot of challenges ahead of us, and we'll certainly talk about some of those today, I actually think it's an incredibly exciting time for our industry. Americans are thinking very differently about retirement in light of what we've been through the last roughly 18 to 24 months. And financial services as an industry is really at a key juncture. Allianz as an organization is very strong and stable. And as you mentioned, we are really in a long-term business of making and keeping promises. So this gives us a nice position of strength to continue to innovate and come up with some new solutions to meet the retirement challenges of today, and also continue to expand some of the products and services we offer by growing our organization. So there's really tremendous demand right now for retirement and risk management solutions that are designed to meet the challenges of today. And I'm very excited to be at an organization that's helping to pave that path forward for Americans.
Well, Jasmine, let's dive into our topic today. I mean, what exactly do you mean by the new reality of retirement? What is it?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to share a brief snapshot of where we're at today when it comes to retirement that I think helps to paint a really interesting picture. So if you take a look at this first slide here, there's $37 trillion of retirement assets in the US right now, and those sit in a wide range of asset classes and product categories. Just by way of reference, that's about 33% of household financial assets. So it's just a huge volume of I guess, challenge and opportunity that's here to solve. But what's equally interesting is that despite these very big numbers, most Americans are not well prepared to retire. A recent study by the Insured Retirement Institute found that older workers clearly have not saved enough for retirement and as a result are very insecure about their retirement finances. Furthermore, they tend to have very unrealistic expectations about how much money they will need to live in retirement. So kind of a double bad combination of thinking that they may have enough, but really having grossly undersaved to be able to meet all of their potential needs that they have for, roughly a 20 to 30 year retirement period. In addition, there is definitely more opportunity for retirees and pre-retirees to work with a financial advisor. This would certainly help to put consumers generally on better footing with a plan that would give them a higher probability of achieving success in retirement. Often left to one's own devices, the only source of information could be family or friends, or potentially to a certain extent an employer. So there's a large and growing need for the important advice that financial advisors can provide to really help consumers be set up for success. All of this really leads to, much more interest and demand from consumers to find ways that they can solve for their retirement needs. We've heard for many, many years that Social Security is not going to be enough. That's proving out to be true with today's baby boomers, and the planning process can be very complex. So this is where a combination of financial advice provided by independent advisors, and then unique and innovative product solutions that are flexible and meet today's consumer needs really are an important combination to help set people up to live a successful and productive life in retirement. In the end, there really are some very seismic shifts that are reshaping how this retirement planning looks. So if you think about in the past, retirement was often about kind of accumulating a nest egg, planning for, your first pension check, maybe a gold watch, or, some other symbols that were very commonly associated with retirement. And, pensions for the most part are really a thing of the past. Employer provided plans like 401ks are growing in importance, and increasingly consumers are turning to their employers for financial advice, but often even those plans can only provide for a portion of what's really needed to live a successful life in retirement. Social Security, of course, no longer really works as a backbone of a plan. It is a piece of the puzzle, but on its own won't be enough. And then we're also seeing, particularly in these COVID days, that life is throwing at us many more competing priorities and challenges. Many people have incurred very unexpected financial events that could have to do with their income or other health challenges that they've incurred. And all these things make it much more difficult to figure out, how to save and how to budget for retirement in the future. The good news, I think, in all this is that Americans are seeing this through a new light. There has been a lot of chaos in the past few years, and I think that's caused more broad recognition, that new and different solutions are needed for these problems. But when I put all this together, there really are three key shifts that I see happening in retirement planning. The first is an increased focus on risk management, and we can talk more about what that looks like and how it's playing out. The second is the need for more holistic retirement planning that addresses not just wealth, but also health and well-being. And then the third are changes in the planning process itself. And this ranges from how technology is utilized, the role a financial advisor plays, and other aspects of how consumers ultimately make their retirement planning decisions. So I can talk for a minute about risk management within retirement. And I think starting here, I'll talk about how we've maybe traditionally prepared for it. As I mentioned, there's always been a lot of focus in the past about building and accumulating a nest egg. And as we know, that's absolutely an important foundational step. However, that really isn't, at the end of the day, the end goal, because it doesn't necessarily account for all the risks that we're going to face when we retire. There's a few factors that are often overlooked in this accumulation phase. One is around longevity. So interestingly enough, now the media is reporting that lifespans are decreasing as a result of COVID, and that can be a bit misleading. So far, the early data looks like the US will go back to about the year 2003 from an average life expectancy perspective, with the average life expectancy declining by about a year and a half, slight variations depending on gender. But that still means most people will live at least 20 or 30 or more years in retirement. So many Americans just simply are not fully accounting for the fact that they will have so many years to live in retirement, and the reality that they very much could outlive those funds. All these things really place more of an emphasis on finding solutions that will offer a steady stream of income in retirement. And this is an area that, Allianz is really focused on as an organization. Inflation is, of course, another key topic. You can't open up the news today without reading about this. Inflation is now at its highest point since 1982, and it doesn't appear that it will be slowing down anytime soon. The other thing about inflation, of course, is it doesn't stop when you reach retirement. So the cost of goods or services on day one of retirement will look completely different in, year 20 or 30. Particularly if you think about things that often constitute a big part of a retiree's expense, such as healthcare. And then the third is market volatility. So in the past, I think it was often conventional wisdom that one could plan for, 1 or 2 bumpy years along the way, but that, things would largely normalize over time. But what we've seen over the past couple of years, and even looking back maybe the last roughly 15 years or so, is that volatility is actually really here to stay. It's taking more of a focus in retirement planning for very good reason, because planning for the unexpected requires much new and different strategies than what we used to have in the past, including how to really forecast what someone's retirement income needs would be once they hit retirement age. I guess the good news in all this is I think Americans are looking at this through a different lens. Financial advisors and professionals are coming to the table with some great solutions to help address these challenges. When I think of a few areas that we've been focused on at Allianz where we've seen growth, it's really combining the opportunity for consumers to have protection against certain market or lifetime events, and also the opportunity to continue to participate in market gains when we do see these big shifts in the market. So products like a registered index link annuity do a great job of doing that. There's a buffer on the downside, and that protection becomes really critical for retirees who need to be able to count on a certain amount of income. Yet there's the opportunity to participate in the market gains and lock in upside, which is a really strong way to help keep pace with some of the risks like inflation. We also see a product category really rising to the top, indexed universal life. And this product, of course, provides death protection, which is what you should always be utilizing life insurance for, but it has a number of flexible features that allows people to access their funds along the way for other life events or critical health or care needs. So all these things are really exciting ways that the financial services industry is contributing to help solve some of these problems that Americans are facing today.
Well, Jasmine, I think you've laid out a very good explanation of the risks involved with in retirement, the managing of risk within retirement, especially longevity, inflation, market volatility. And it's interesting to hear about these new products that are out there. But I was particularly curious about the second bullet, the second point that you are trying to make, which was that we now need to really think about retirement in a much more holistic way, addressing not just wealth, but also health and well-being. So is that, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The second pillar really is an increased connection between wealth and health and well-being, which is driving the need for much more holistic financial planning. COVID, again, really put mortality and morbidity in the spotlight. If you think about it, there's probably no one here in the audience today who doesn't know of someone who had a material impact to their health in one way or another related to this virus. And I think that's really caused a lot of people to stop and think about all the other aspects of managing their health and well-being and how those really fit together in terms of a picture of how they want to live in retirement. Life insurance is one example that we've really seen take off. So of course, that death benefit protection is a very important foundation of any financial plan. But I think the need for this protection is now really recognized more by consumers. Since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, life insurance sales have increased 22%. And if you look back over the prior, period of years, sales have been largely pretty flat. They may have shifted from one product type to another, but that huge increase really signals recognition on the part of consumers that they need to be able to have more protection in their portfolio and prepare for the unexpected as it relates to health outcomes. Another change pertaining to well-being is this great resignation. I think some folks, of course, chose to leave their professions and try new ones. Others were forced to make a change. We've also seen a huge influx of new retirees recently. The Federal Reserve Bank in St. Louis published a study recently saying that 3 million more people have retired during COVID than they would have during kind of a normalized period leading up into the pandemic. Looking at that, that's just a huge number of people who made a huge lifestyle change relatively rapidly. And then workers today, I think, really are looking for and seeking a very different type of work-life balance. In many cases, we're hearing from employees, and I think it's well understood in the market that life often comes first. I think the pandemic caused many of us to take a look at the balance that we had, and we found new and creative ways to find some new balance. So that in and of itself affects how people are looking at their careers and looking at work, and maybe even willingness to make changes for jobs that they wouldn't otherwise have been able to make. And then I think there's the changes that were perhaps less optional and more a function of the environment we've been forced to make that also changed the retirement planning game for people. If you take a look at women in the workforce, they have really been impacted. The Census Bureau has published a statistic saying that 3.5 million women with school-aged children have been forced to leave the workforce since COVID. And of course, this is having a much more profound impact on women of color. So we can really see all these things coming together in different ways. We have folks forced into retirement earlier than they were thinking they would be, and they're really pressed for solutions to help them live successfully in retirement. We're seeing different compositions of jobs and saving profiles. And we're seeing, the war for talent and the labor crunch, and it's not yet clear how that's going to play out. So what will be very interesting, of course, is to see what does this all look like 20 or 30 years from now. But one thing is for sure, it's really critical that a financial plan addresses all these aspects of wellness and that we're much more prepared to be flexible in the future going forward.
No, it's what you're saying is absolutely fascinating because, at one level, I think it's wonderful that this pandemic has forced a lot of people to think about what they really want out of life and their careers. I mean, how do they want their work life to play out? And of course, others have been forced into it, as you said. Some it wasn't out of choice, some it was out of, the necessity. And so there's been this great resignation. There's been rethinking of the balance between work and life. And I think, a lot of it is very positive. But, what concerns me a little bit is that what does this great resignation do to people who are not going to be thinking about, maybe they're not retiring the next 5 years, but people who are retiring 20, 30 years from now. I mean, you talked about all the risks involved, the increasing longevity, the market volatility, and, how is that going to impact people's planning for retirement? Have you any, I'm sure you've thought about that. So could you give us some insight?
Yeah. Well, as you said, it's very true. We don't yet know how it's going to play out, but I think what we do know is that retirement planning strategies of the past aren't going to work for a lot of Americans whose lives have just fundamentally changed, including how they're earning money and how they're saving money as they're in those kind of pre-retirement accumulation years. But I've heard some people go so far as to say, are we even creating, inadvertently, of course, another new retirement crisis? We are seeing Americans focusing much more on the here and now. And I think that's understandable when we're living in a world with so much uncertainty. And frankly, many people have been waiting to do things for a long time that might have at one point seemed routine, taking a big vacation or other lifestyle sorts of choices that people are making. But that doesn't always mean that folks are putting the same lens on thinking for the future when really it's, more of a focus on what am I doing today and how can I enjoy what my life is like right now. Another interesting trend is how many workers are moving to jobs in what's, the so-called gig economy. The latest number I heard from Fortune the other day was 29%. And that just kind of boggles my mind. Roughly a third of the workforce. The part about retirement planning, though, that makes that really troublesome is the vast majority of those folks then would not have access to employer-sponsored plans, something like a 401k. And those are often a really basic component of helping to ensure a level of financial security in retirement, particularly when employers are offering matches or other incentives to encourage savings. So the absence of those plans for roughly a third of the workforce means, different solutions will be needed. And then consumer spending has really fluctuated a lot in this pandemic. And, depending on what you read or where you read, some people say consumer spending is now rising, others say it's still really muted. But one thing is for sure, we haven't seen steady results on that front. And so what will this all look like when retirees who've maybe been more conservative and saving more in their early years here, all of a sudden are starting to spend at a much higher rate? Will they have thought through all of the risks that they need to plan for and making sure that they have enough money to live comfortably through a longer retirement? So I think it's too early to say what's going to happen. There could be another crisis upon us. It probably will look different than how it has in the past. But I also think that with, an increased focus on personalized planning that's very holistic, looking at all these factors, and then utilizing risk management solutions to help kind of protect the downside risk. Those are things that, the industry's tackling, and if taken into account early enough, can really help mitigate a crisis down the road.
Well, we certainly hope that the crisis doesn't become as bad as it could, but I think one of the things that is on the positive side, I think if there is more focus perhaps on the health and the well-being part of your, the trifecta, if you will, of retirement planning, then perhaps the wealth can be, it may not be as much of a crisis as we, as it could be. So I would love to know again, how does a firm like Allianz help out in this more holistic sort of view of health and wealth and well-being altogether?
Yeah, well, I'll give you a few examples. I think one of the areas where companies like Allianz really shine is not necessarily as much focused on the accumulation side of the equation, but really making sure that there's effective and efficient ways to decumulate or utilize that nest egg upon retirement. And of course, as we've talked about, this really needs to plan for all those risks and variables that can happen over the course of retirement. I think, we work through independent financial advisors who are really changing their practices and the way that they're consulting with consumers to do this planning. And that's happening with the use of some fairly sophisticated technology that brings a much more holistic view of all of one's assets kind of into one place. That really allows for more proactive advice, more real-time decision-making where that becomes appropriate, and the ability to make trade-offs in a portfolio that ultimately will help improve the probability of success. The health side of it really is, an interesting challenge. I think it's, we talked a lot about how consumers are facing their own morbidity and mortality in new ways. And of course, the cost of healthcare keeps going up. We also have a huge issue in our country here in the US with, the non-communicable diseases. So things that are linked more to lifestyle and behavior. Examples of that, of course, that are prevalent, like diabetes or lung disease or heart disease. Those account for, a huge portion of deaths in the US and could be as high as, 70% is the projection by 2030 if you look at, actuarial studies and research. So one of the areas we really believe is so critical to focus on is what can we do to help improve those health outcomes and really help kind of manage ways that consumers can take control of their health early and avoid some of those challenges later on. I do think technology is going to play a really critical role in this. There's, tons of wearables and smart devices now that make access to more data so much more easy for consumers. And I think it also makes it easier for insurers to work with consumers to share data, in which cases both can benefit. There's examples now already where consumers are working with life insurance companies who will provide proactive reminders and notifications about, wellness or disease management issues. And those things really are a way to, of course, establish more of a value proposition with consumers, but also help really with the shared economics of better healthy living. So those are areas where, we're beginning to do work. And I know many other companies in the industry are aggressively looking to help bring solutions. And then finally, when I think about what we do here at Allianz, a big portion of what consumers consider with retirement is their legacy, or, what happens at the end of life. So making sure we have good financial solutions that work across a wide range of economic scenarios to allow folks to leave a legacy. And then we're looking at the increased need for services to help people live successfully in retirement. So most people today don't want to go to a nursing home. They want to age at home, or they want to be able to be close to family. So we're working closely with a few partners on some services that support aging in place more effectively, or caregiver support, those who are taking care of the elderly at end of life, and how can we help them achieve better outcomes. So what's exciting to see is I think these things are really converging together, and insurers are, a big part of the solution in helping folks live a much more successful life in retirement.
This is fascinating because, all along we're always thought, okay, retirement planning is about, are you going to hit the number, whatever that number is, and the number, of course, keeps changing as you sort of, progress through life. So it's kind of fascinating that you talk about how we need to do much more than think about just financial, financial health in as we plan for retirement. There's so many questions that have to be answered, and they have to be answered by customers. But they, it feels like there's a real role for, not just the consumers, but for financial professionals, for financial services companies and others, in sort of helping consumers navigate through this process. So, do you have any thoughts on this? How are folks going to interact? You mentioned technology as one big change agent, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this somehow.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. The need for more personalization is definitely there. And I think technology is a really key enabler to making some of that happen. If you think about the changes that are happening in the financial planning process, which is really the third pillar that I described, they've just been tremendous. Some of the digitization, of course, really accelerated by the pandemic, but I think it's here to stay because the benefits for consumers are so great. So, if you think about flash back maybe 10, 15 years or more, quite often meetings with financial advisors focused on looking back at the past. How did my investments perform, or, what sort of returns did I get on this account or that account? None of that really is needed anymore with, the easy access to this information real time on apps on your phone or websites or other technologies. So today it's quite easy just to look that up yourself. And the financial advisors are really getting called upon then to shift from a look back to, really being more proactive. There's some really great technology out there that aggregates clients' accounts into really a single view that helps advisors and consumers see the big picture. And that really, of course, allows advisors to give better advice. It simplifies access because as a consumer, you can get all of your account information in one place at one time. And it also helps advisors identify places where they need to tap into experts to really address specialized solutions. Some of that's through technology, and some of that's just through other human advice, which I think is, of course, a really critical ingredient in a successful plan. So these are areas where, I see tremendous amount of change has happened in the last 12 months. Even virtual client meetings would have never been heard of before the pandemic, but now clients love them. And advisors can spend their time really focusing on the more proactive planning and not, traveling around to meetings. There's also been a lot of activity in the customer experience space that's pretty exciting. One of the great things about the Twin Cities is we have a very thriving fintech scene here. And there's a number of really fantastic startups doing great work in this space. So how to make, the underwriting process easier, as an example, for consumers by utilizing data that's available in a more streamlined fashion and provides faster access to data for faster decision making. There's a number of companies in town, including Allianz, our friends at Securian, and others who are really actively involved in investing in these fintechs through venture capital arms. And that's been a great way for insurance companies like us to, get access to this new technology and to be able to bring it to consumers through the financial advisors that we work with. I would also say, one other trend that's quite interesting about this is, how consumers view companies that they want to work with in light of sustainability. So I think a few years back, if we would have surveyed consumers, we wouldn't have necessarily found sustainable investing to be a key theme in their decision making. But we're finding now that strength and stability of a company is really important, but consumers also really want to partner with a company that they believe is doing the right thing, particularly as it pertains to their investments. So we recently conducted a study with consumers that showed 64% of Americans have a positive opinion on sustainable investing. Nearly 2/3 would say that they would actually reallocate money from a company that wasn't adhering to sustainability principles to one that does. So sort of a reward and punishment strategy, which is very interesting. And then also over 60% believe that a commitment to environmental sustainability by financial services companies would be a key factor in how they decide which company they want to work with. So I think for the whole industry, this is something really important for us to stay attuned to. And it's one of the ways that, as an industry, we can help influence positive change in society while still, of course, delivering positive investment outcomes for customers.
Well, some of the things you've been saying is music to our ears, all of us who are in higher education, things like, how artificial intelligence, the technology behind these fintechs, et cetera, that's becoming more and more important because that's what we training our students increasingly to do, as well as, the interest in sustainability. I think that too is something our students are very, very interested in, and we want to try and make sure that they have an understanding of how to adhere to those ESG principles, sustainable development goals, et cetera, while still keeping an eye on profit and purpose. I mean, the planet is important as well. And so as we, as I'm listening to you, it feels like this whole retirement planning field is so complex and so, it's so interesting, but also so complex. What, do you have any final thoughts or messages for people who are trying to sort of, navigate their way through this? What's the best advice that you might give them?
Yeah, so we've talked today, there's just a tremendous amount of change happening around us. So I think one of the most important things is really to be flexible and to be prepared for the unexpected. Flashback 2 years, I think very few of us would have ever thought that a pandemic like COVID would have been here, and think of all the ways that probably for each of us personally, it's really changed our lives, not to mention what it's done for our society and our economy. So really just thinking about, how to be prepared for twists and turns that come up over the course of a 20 or 30 year time period in retirement is a super critical factor. Each person's situation will be different. So I talked about sort of this convergence and intersection of wealth and health and well-being. We each have our own priorities and our own factors that we need to consider. So I think it's very important to be proactive in thinking about a picture of, what does a successful retirement look like for you? And then seeking advice from someone who can help you figure out the best way to get there. For each of us, it's not going to be, one product or one solution that's a silver bullet, but it's really coming up with a combination of strategies that we can use to manage risk in a way that helps to keep our priorities at the forefront. And I can say from my own experience, even personally being in this business for, more than 25 years, I greatly value the advice a financial advisor gives me to help make those decisions. I think, companies like Allianz are in a great position to be part of the future and part of shaping these solutions. There's lots of positive headwinds that are tailwinds, I should say, that, are going to help us get there. Even the government is recognizing with, changes like the Secure Act that we have to find ways to make products that manage retirement risk more accessible to more Americans. So, we're really committed to doing our part in achieving that goal. And in the end, I think for all of us, having a very holistic plan that takes into account all these different factors is going to give us the highest probability of success as individuals and in achieving the goals that we set out for ourselves in retirement.
Well, this is, I think, great advice, and not just for, folks in the US, because Allianz is a global company and you have, operations everywhere. I know we have at least one person, Mario Asher from Buenos Aires, on the call today. So it is a worldwide audience that you're talking to right now. But, this has just been delightful, this conversation. And I think it's really putting a lot of things in perspective for those, for all of us who have to think about, how we're going to live out our golden years, if you will. And, at this point, I know there are tons of questions from the audience, so I'm going to turn it over to Amy to sort of moderate the Q&A and get some questions directly from the audience to you.
Yes, they've got lots of questions here for you, Jasmine. The first one has to do with boards and serving on boards. So this is a question from Laura Murphy. Laura says, I've seen you serve on a few boards. Your time is valuable. How do you decide which nonprofit boards to give your time and talent to? Does your company require or encourage it? How do boards like College Possible and Minnesota Business Partnership recruit you? And then she says, P.S. I work for a nonprofit and I'm always wondering how C-level folks participation happens. So I think she's looking for some advice as well.
Okay, sure. Well, certainly our company really does encourage employees at all levels of the organization to get involved in boards and give back to the community. And one of the things that I love about our community strategy is we also provide some financial contributions to the boards where our employees serve. So I think that's a way that we can help get more people involved and willing to participate. For me, I think it's been important to find things that intersect with my personal passions as well as things that are relevant to the business, because you're right, all of our time is very precious. So we have to spend it in ways that is meaningful to us. Personally, I really believe that we have an obligation as an industry and as successful business people to give back. Particularly to the younger generation of children who might have more obstacles to having a successful life in adulthood than some of us may have had. So some of the nonprofits that I've been really, it's been a joy to be a part of, like Washburn Center for Children, College Possible are a few examples, are really committed to helping young kids get a great start at life with either mental health services, access to education, et cetera. So that's been a way for me to bring those things together. In terms of recruiting, my experience is it's often about relationships. So typically I've known about organizations because of my interests, but then I've had connections to people who've been on the board or have known executive directors of organizations. But I think you'd find, as I talk to peers at our company, at other Minnesota-based companies, or even nationally or globally, most executives really want an opportunity to be a part of a nonprofit and give back. So I think there's a lot more appetite out there than might meet the eye.
Thank you. We get that question a lot, actually, in alumni relations. So John is asking, what changes do you anticipate to the very idea of retirement at a set age, as opposed to based in actual disability? Will it become more common to trade years at the end of life to take longer periods to work or travel, study, practice religion, or the like, in exchange for working later into your life?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point that we didn't touch on, but we are starting to see that happen. So there are people entering and re-entering the workforce in sort of different capacities. Some of that, takes place in this gig economy that I cited, where people may leave a traditional corporate job and then they take some time away, and then they're finding some alternative ways to enter the workforce and make money. That does appear to be an even greater interest or emerging trend with younger generations. So we probably haven't yet seen how that will play out with, the millennials and the Gen Z. I think for the Gen Xers and baby boomers, it's probably a little bit more of a traditional trajectory at this point from what we've seen. But all of that affects then, I think, how we think about a lifetime of financial wellness. Retirement might not be an event as much as it is planning for those times that one is out of the workforce. So while the mechanics might look different, the same principles apply of, how do you really best manage your risk during those times? and how do you make sure that you're saving enough and achieving effective outcomes with the various strategies that you have in place to manage through those non-working times of your life.
Thank you so much. This question is perfect for your response here, as it does ask about the gig economy. She says, with so much of us in the gig economy, how can we best plan for our retirement with no support from corporations? I know I can research Obamacare options, build my own life and disability insurance, save and post-tax REA, et cetera, or RIA, but this is a complicated research and it gets simply handed to us in a benefits brochure on your first day of work. In your mind, how does this look and how do people handle this in the future?
For people who are in the gig economy?
Correct, yep.
So I actually think this is a huge market opportunity that's waiting to be capitalized on because I have not seen or heard of a company or an organization that's figured out how to provide this service yet. It seems like it would be really incredibly useful. I think, I'm not in a position to give really financial advice especially without knowing the circumstances of the individual. But I do think there's a couple of things. There are a number of digital tools and sort of calculators and planning software resources that are out there. I've seen and heard of a few that are really designed for more of an intermittent work and income planning. Those might be helpful in terms of thinking through the pros and cons of saving mechanisms and which products make the most sense. I do think also this is where utilizing a financial planner can be quite helpful. A lot of people think, oh, this is so unaffordable. I couldn't possibly, have a relationship with an advisor, but there's lots of relationships and cost structures available that can make it very accessible to folks to utilize. If you do have access to any sort of employer plan, most employer plans do offer a sort of retirement planning benefit or consultative service that comes along with it. I can say at Allianz, the participants in our 401k plan can utilize help from a virtual, like a video conferencing technology to ask questions about their specific situation. And that's something people really love and take advantage of. But for the kind of entrepreneurs in the audience, I really believe this is a huge unmet need in the market where we've got, roughly 30% of the workforce in jobs that don't really provide a clear and easy mechanism for planning. And so what sort of solutions could be brought to bear that's targeted to that audience to really help them be successful? And I'd love to see someone in our industry go after that.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much. It's a little challenge there, Cherie. We need to get our students on that maybe.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a great, project to, for our home center students to kind of engage in,
Yes, absolutely. We're getting questions about, what is the role of a company such as Allianz to be involved in change in the community? Do you have any direct thoughts about that specifically?
Yeah, I do. I think it does tie a bit to what I was referencing with sustainability as a category, but I think any corporation, has an obligation to be part of making the community in which we live healthy and vibrant and successful. That helps everyone who lives and works and resides in the community. So how that looks can be a bit different depending on the organization and what best fits with their business and where their strengths are. If I look at Allianz's example, we've really focused our community engagement efforts through either giving or volunteerism or other activities around what we're calling economic inclusion. That fits well because we are, in the business of financial services and financial planning, so we can help bring expertise to the table to solve those challenges. And we also fundamentally believe one of the big barriers to success in some parts of our community is around access to sort of basic financial resources at different phases of one's life journey. So, we're partnering with organizations that are really focused on that, helping to reach some underrepresented or underprivileged communities, as well as, bringing that financial planning acumen to groups like students, where we can help, build a skill set early on that will set them up for success down the road, all in the interest of how do we make the community a financially inclusive place for everyone. And that's how we're all going to win. When we all have kind of the basics of, quality of life, and we're all part of the community, that's what's going to make our community grow and thrive and be a better place to live and also to do business.
Yes, thank you. We have another question that kind of ties into community. How does your company or companies such as Allianz embed D&I practices effectively into the company?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think a hot topic of conversation as I'm talking to others in our industry and leaders of other companies in the Twin Cities. Like many companies, we've been doing a ton of work in this space, but we also still have a lot to do. So I don't want to make it sound as if we have all the answers or the perfect strategy. But I really think we've taken the approach at Allianz of saying, how do we start first with our employee base? What can we do to make sure that we have created an environment that is inclusive and equitable and diverse and really represents the communities where we live and work within the kind of virtual four walls of our organization, and provide support to help make sure that all the right infrastructure is in place to allow for career advancement and development of, again, all segments of our population. We've had to do a lot of work to kind of build some of those things into our processes, but that's really been our primary focus. As we look then to extend that reach out into the community, as I mentioned, one of the areas that we're really focused on is economic inclusion, and that does often intersect or cross over with other diversity and inclusion goals that we have, or the nonprofits that we work with have as well. So I think it really is kind of a continuation of, the values that we have at our culture and how we bring those to life with what we do for our employees and the culture we have here at the company. And then how do we extend that out into the community as really a reflection of who we are and how we engage with the world outside.
Yes, thank you. All right, we have one more question, a little bit different topic here. Timothy is saying, he has read from another life insurance company in Ohio that recently shared death rates are about 40% over what they were pre-pandemic. Not all are directly attributable to COVID. Are you seeing a similar thing in Minnesota? Do you have any thoughts about what's driving this? Is there anything that I don't know if you have direct data on that or anything, but just kind of holistically would be curious about.
Yeah, I don't know about the 40% rate, but I will say that I think one of the key drivers that we understand from some of our actuarial studies and research, and I believe this has also been cited by the CDC, is that the kind of excess mortality that we've seen in the pandemic, or I guess simply put, a higher death rate, isn't all due to COVID. In fact, a lot of it is due to other non-COVID issues affecting the younger population that haven't necessarily been treated as proactively or as effectively in light of the pandemic. So there's a lot of residual effects from delaying healthcare, things like proactive health screening, elective surgeries. A lot of that was deferred and delayed for a period of time, and very unfortunately is resulting in more deaths from other non-COVID activities. But still, when you put all that together, at least the recent studies that we have been looking at internally show that on average, this is translating into an increase or a reduction in mortality of about 1.1 to 1.2 years for women and about 1.6 to 7 years for males. So I don't know if that would quite translate to the 40% rate, but it is true that we're seeing, more effects of that delayed wellness. And that's something obviously that we can hopefully remedy very quickly now as we figure out how we live with this virus and are able to resume some of our normal healthcare activities.
No, I think, this is really important as we look at, the mortality effects of this around this time, but also just the impacts of the pandemic across different communities. And I think it's particularly meaningful to have this conversation, at this time. Today is the first day of Black History Month, and we know that, our populations of color have been sort of unduly affected by the pandemic, as have women. It is also the Lunar New Year. So for our global community. It's also a day of beginning a week full of rejoicing. So I wish anyone who celebrates, I wish them well. And I think one of the things that is, I think, really interesting. And do we have a few minutes for one more question from me, Amy? We probably do, right? Okay, so I just, I'm a student of international business and international relations, and I know Allianz is you're in this unique position of heading the North American unit of a European firm, and so you probably have some insight into how do we as Americans, fare in terms of our retirement or in terms of planning for retirement compared to folks from other parts of the world. Do you have any insight or thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah, I can share a little bit about that. We do share this interest in international business, but every country has its own nuances. Allianz, as a global company, does business in 80 or 90 different countries. So you can imagine the variation that you would see from market to market. I think the two things that make the US really particularly interesting, one is consumers have to take more control, and they have to take more control earlier in their life. And where we see that, play out as a kind of, as an example is, as I mentioned, the lack of employer provided pensions and the fact that our social security system just isn't designed to really provide a sustainable level of retirement income for folks now as they're entering their retirement years. But all that said, I would say even countries like Germany are still struggling with this. So the Germans have a system in which about 9% of your income is paid into the state. A state provided pension comes back to you when you retire that's based on what your income was at the time of your working years and how many years you worked. But even that system, which has been around for a very long time, is feeling a tremendous amount of pressure. And the limits are getting tested. So even they're increasing their retirement age to 67 by the year 2029. So I think we're not unique in that we're facing a crisis. Much of this is demographic. But the other thing that Americans have historically done is not saved as well on their own. So we do see in other markets more of a savings culture, and that's typically just, I guess, maybe American spontaneity and other factors that cause a few differences. But the one thing that I love about being part of a global company is we do get to see and learn from lots of different experiences. Sometimes when we think we're worse off, we're not, and this is an example of that. But one other thing that Americans are known for is entrepreneurship, innovation, and ingenuity. And that's one of the things that we're able to bring to the Allianz group from Allianz here in the US, is we really are a leader in designing innovative solutions to help consumers in retirement. And many of those solutions have been adopted by other countries around the world within the Allianz family. So I'm super proud that we can carry the flag for American innovation and be part of helping retirees in other parts of the world live a better life too.
And thank you for carrying the flag for all of us, and especially in bringing all these retirement planning solutions to so many who need it. So this has been a wonderful conversation, Jasmine. Thank you for participating. I think we've all learned a great deal from it. So just wonderful to have you here. I know going forward to the community out there, we have the next first Tuesday, which is going to be on in March, is going to have John Naylor, who is the CEO of Medica. And you can also preview the rest of our very exciting lineup for the rest of the semester, and we will let you know whether we'll be online or in person or in hybrid formats as safety conditions evolve. We want to make sure that people stay safe and healthy, but we're also all looking forward to getting back in person. So as soon as we can do so safely, we will be back in person. So have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for joining us. Hope you can all join us in March. And again, Jasmine, thank you for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much, Dean.